Coming up on Nebraska Stories, how a tiny Nebraska town became part of America's space race. Thinking big about living small. Portraiture and the healing power of art. And a statue honoring the first Native American doctor.
Sometimes you couldn't hardly see across your yard, just so dense with dust. You kind of wondered, how did we exist?
In the early 1930s, there's a proto-space race that has emerged between the Soviets, the United States, and independent French aviators to reach the highest levels of the stratosphere and prove that human beings can ultimately survive at high altitude and then eventually space. The Explore One project was a collaboration between the National Geographic Society and the Army Air Corps, the precursor to the Air Force today. The National Geographic Society paid for the construction of the gondola, the balloon, the scientific equipment. The Army Air Corps would provide the infrastructure, the pilots, the technical know-how to actually operate this balloon. This private-public partnership between these two entities allowed for an expensive and successful expedition to happen in the middle of the Depression. They needed a place that would have ideal weather conditions, but then also on the ground, you needed something that would protect the balloon as they were inflating it. You can't have that thing flailing around because it takes a while to get all the hydrogen into the balloon. They ultimately settle on the Strato Bowl outside Rapid City, South Dakota. They built a military base at the Strato Bowl. It had a hospital, 2 radio stations, barracks, and then thousands of hydrogen containers just lining the rims of the Strato Bowl. Miles upon miles of rope that is required to control the balloon. The balloon itself requires under 3 acres of fabric, which took 5 months to fabricate it. It was linen that was rubberized and then produced by hand by the Goodyear Zeppelin Company. The gondola itself was produced by the Dow Chemical Corporation. It was a magnesium alloy and it weighed 700 pounds. They picked some of the most talented men in the Army Air Corps. One of the men has the parachute record at this point in time, 24,000 feet. You've got the first human being to photograph and see the curvature of the Earth. You've got men who have been in the air, who have been in balloons, high altitude situations. Some have combat experience in the First World War. These are men who are trained, who are experts. They know what they're doing. They're very well aware of the dangers of what could happen. Hydrogen, like helium, is a lighter than air gas, very abundant, but has the unfortunate side effect of being very explosive. As we all know from the Hindenburg explosion, which happens a couple of years later. They are constantly checking the weather. They work all through the day and then all through the night. They've got to put all the pieces together. They've got to get the batteries in, as well as radio equipment, all sorts of different sensors. They load cold weather clothing because this is not an insulated gondola. They are going to pass through some very, very cold portions of the atmosphere. They are getting everything prepped and ready to go. And they just lift and lift and lift. They begin to drift south. They're going over northwestern Nebraska. There are spotter airplanes that are following them. The equipment is working, they're making their observations, and everything is going real fine. There's suddenly a shudder. A tear forms in the envelope, and they realize that they're not going to be able to make it to the 75,000 feet that they wanted. They need to slowly and have a very controlled descent if they're going to survive. They're about 5,000 feet above Loomis, Nebraska. They are in preparation to jump. Somebody steps on Captain Anderson's parachute and releases the parachute in the gondola. And so he has it bunched up in his arms and is at the top of the parachute. And he and Major Kepner are having a debate about how they should, whether he can just heave his parachute out, and will it catch, will it land, will he survive? The balloon explodes and the gondola just becomes a bomb. Captain Anderson just heaves his parachute out. It catches. Major Kepner kicks Captain Stevens out one of the portholes. And then Kepner's the last one to land. The gondola lands about 150 feet before them, just exploding all over Reuben Johnson's cornfield. At the time, everyone in the nation was glued to their radio sets, listening to this live. After the crash happens, Major Kepner makes his way to the Johnson farmhouse, gets on the phone, and calls headquarters. He's talking with headquarters, and then a voice breaks in and says, "It's NBC, you're going live, tell everybody what's going on." And in this moment, thousands of people are descending upon this cornfield north of Loomis. Everybody in central Nebraska wants to be a part of it. There's no crowd control. People are pocketing pieces of the envelope. There's a gentleman who takes an entire hatch and later donates it to the State Historical Society in Lincoln, where it remains. They're taking the scientific equipment. They're taking really whatever they can get their hands on because they want to be part of this event. They want to have a souvenir. This becomes a problem. The National Geographic Society and the Army Air Corps want everything back so they can figure out what happened. There are calls that are put out in all of the local papers saying, "Did you take something?" The Kearney Hub leads this effort, and locals are sending things back to the National Geographic Society. The cause of the crash is ultimately determined, fault with the envelope, that it froze, opened and cracked, and tore, and the National Geographic Society sends stuff back. Today, the Nebraska Prairie Museum, Fort Kearny Museum in Kearney, as well as History Nebraska, all have artifacts from this expedition.
My dad was a souvenir seeker. He took something that he shouldn't have. But at the same time, we today get to share in what it was. This is little tiny pellets of lead. And this was used as ballast in the balloon. I was 4 years old, and my parents, they were out observing. I thought, what would cause them to be looking up at the sky for something? They have gotten news by the radio about this balloon coming across from South Dakota. And I remember finally I said, oh, I can see that white spot up there. We were 4 miles northwest of the crash site. So my dad went to the site, came home, he put it in the bottle. It's been in this bottle for 90 years. But I also remember days in that period of time, we had severe dust storms. Some days it'd last for days and days. Sometimes almost blackouts, just dust.
It was a media sensation. It has been forgotten and remembered and forgotten and remembered. People in central Nebraska, in the darkest of their days, finding support or comfort or connection into a wider world, that they could be part of something, they could be part of something greater.
Great architecture will raise our senses, enhance our senses. I started to appreciate the beautiful remoteness of this place. And I think in designing a building like this, what we hope to do is to help other people appreciate that beautiful remoteness. The initial stages, the concept design of this project was really to set up the shape of the building, the concept of it being a micro-dwelling, and then to work with students over time into developing those details.
Well, you sit in the classroom and you do designs and you have papers and you do crits, right? And they stand there and they look at it and say, well, this can happen, this can happen, this can happen. Here, we come out here and we can physically touch what we built. Yeah, it's no longer a concept, it's a reality.
These are the students that I'm working with here. We're just doing a few adaptations of it. But again, you get a good idea of how enthusiastic they are about building things here, about getting hands-on experience.
Yeah, we just
Yeah, no, that's good. In Nebraska, in the Great Plains region, there's a deep tradition of people knowing how to build their own buildings and a strong connection between the land and architecture. We're really indebted to the way that students are really passionate about doing things that matter to their community and doing things that matter to the places they come from. It was really set up to think about the relationship between what we do in the architecture school and the state of Nebraska. What we try to do is to find ways of inventing ways of using trees, particularly within this part of the state, and the type of trees that may get discarded. And Eastern red cedar is definitely one of them because it's regarded as being an invasive tree. It's not, it's a native tree, but it's regarded as being invasive. We've looked for ways to use the Eastern red cedar tree and other native trees in the most efficient possible way. Even though we build most of this building out of Eastern red cedar, we're also inventing new ways of using it for things like cabinets here. We're using it for doors. We're using it for work surfaces like this. And that's part of the student's process of learning to use the whole tree.
What's important to remember about Miser's Ruin is it is one aspect of a much larger partnership between architecture and Cedar Point Biological Station. So I'm very interested in sort of portraying this image for a field station as being sustainable as possible. And that plays in really well from sort of our vision for the station, adding in these housing units.
Over 90% of it was built with materials that came from within 1 mile of the site. What that does is help reduce what we call the embodied energy of the building. The embodied energy is the amount of energy that it takes to bring materials from their location to the site. So we've managed to calculate in this building that we're actually sequestering or pulling out of the atmosphere 1.4 tons of carbon. Now, if you took a building of an equivalent size, built in conventional construction, we'd probably be putting about 7 tons of carbon into the atmosphere. So when students are working on these projects, milling trees, cutting them up in a mobile mill that we have down here, and getting them to the site, they're directly invested in the energy flow. We're not just producing a building, we're talking about materiality, we're talking about the rural context, and we're talking about what it means to consume materials when we're making architecture. So we've been working on this building for the last 4 years. There are a few finishing touches that we need to make, and then we're going to be able to welcome visitors into this space. And that's really exciting for us and really exciting for the architecture program and all the students that have been involved in this project.
I don't worry about things like precision. What I'm trying to do is to make sure that every mark I make is a direct and honest response to who's in front of me. Each mark is also not just drawing what I see, which is fundamental, but it's also to a certain extent drawing what I'm experiencing, what I'm feeling.
There's a symmetry in the journey of Scottish artist Mark Gilbert. Nearly 20 years ago, Mark passed through Omaha with an international tour of his landmark exhibition, Saving Faces, which featured arresting portraits of patients before, during, and after dramatic and sometimes disfiguring facial surgeries.
To be showing in this space, especially in this space, because this is where it all started with me in Omaha. So I'd never been here before. And so it's lovely to be back here.
Now, Mark is a professor of medical humanities at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where the first exhibit took place. Still an artist, he continues to do portraiture. This work is part of a study exploring the experiences of frontline healthcare workers across the country.
I often talk about the sort of vulnerability that there is on both sides of the easel when you're working on these portraits. I've worked with people who know that they're in the last weeks of their life. I've worked with people who are caring for people who they know are terminally ill and so on. And I've never worked with people who are that their emotions were so on the surface and so raw. They broke down in a way that had never happened with anybody else I've ever worked with in the last 20 years. They were working crazy hours. They were working with huge uncertainties about the care that they were able to deliver for the patients they were working with, about their own well-being, about when is this going to end, about am I going to infect the people I care for, my family, my children.
Mark has probably had a dozen sessions with nurse practitioner Sarah Lane during the past few years, even during the height of the COVID pandemic.
And I remember after my first meeting with Mark, we talked about a lot of things that I hadn't ever really maybe tapped into. And so I remember going home and just being exhausted. It brought on so many emotions of just overall sadness for the patients and, my coworkers and the struggle that, we were all having. That's what really prompted a lot of the, you know, why I continued to come back, because I just knew that this was important. People will ask me about it and I can't really answer it. Like in my head, I know, you know, what it was about and what it did for me, but it's hard to share that with other people, to put it to words.
I'm not an art therapist. I don't do these pictures to make people feel better, but often it does. So, and when that happens, we recognize that and record it, and I'm pleased.
Even in silence, there can be a therapeutic dialogue. As Gilbert's most recent exhibit involving dementia patients in Halifax, Nova Scotia reveals.
It took me years to properly recognize this, that silence isn't an empty void. There's a huge amount of communication that happens in that silence. There's a huge amount of expression, either, you know, with us both looking at each other. And the drawing facilitates that, facilitates the relationship building. When we think about people with dementia, sometimes we end up thinking that they've kind of lost so much that they have nothing left to give. That they've lost the capacity to be productive or to be purposeful. But hopefully the exhibition is able to allow people to really engage and maybe even re-engage with that notion that people who are living with dementia still have an amazing sense of personhood. There still are things that nourish them. There are still things that bring joy.
Every frame is a window into a deeply private world.
We don't often see this depicted in art.
Yeah.
You know, that there's a veil across that chapter of life that I think that your work helps to lift.
Yeah.
Gerontology professor Dr. Chris Kelly says the lives of older adults are often overlooked.
Our last days were spent among family and friends, those who were closest to us. The rest of the world is kind of outside of that veil. What Mark has done with this exhibit is pulled back that veil and to show us the beauty of life in that penultimate chapter, and to have a better understanding of just what individuals are going through. The feelings, the fears, the many emotions that they are experiencing. Art and literature and music and everything that the creative world is about is a part of our lives from our earliest memory to our last moments on earth. That lifelong education doesn't stop. And I think that for the subjects of Mark's paintings, I think that they were aware that they were participating in something incredible, that they're participating in the education and the understanding of people of all ages, what it means to be human.
So this was a piece, yeah, so it was done in 1992. And so it's just kind of typical of the kind of drawings that my dad would do. You know, prior to every single painting that he did, he always did a series, and we all had to sit for him. You know, I had to pose for him.
Mark's own mom had Alzheimer's and died of a stroke before this project began.
It's called The Chair, but I think I always call it the empty chair. So it is the empty chair. It's the chair that my mom sat in. So again, it's that testament to bereavement, to loss.
This is the first time Mark's work has hung side by side with his dad's. Both of his parents were artists. They met at the Glasgow School of Art in the 1950s.
It wasn't unusual for him to be sitting for me in the morning and I'd be sitting for him in the afternoon. This was when we were in Glasgow. So these pictures are kind of unique in as much that they picture my mum on her own.
When Mark's mom, Pat, was in her final days, his father, Norman, made these drawings of her.
I was staggered that he was doing them, frightened to look at them. You know, I didn't want to look at them. And I remember he asked me about 2 or 3 times, do you want to see them? And I said, no, not yet. And then when I saw them, I loved them, you know. And again, it kind of forced me to come from behind the easel. You know, so it kind of was almost like I became like one of my participants. Those pictures sort of present some of the most traumatic times of my life, and I love them.
Norman passed a few years after his wife, Pat, and never had the chance to see these works displayed together. But the drawings serve another purpose: to soften the medical gaze and invite new understandings of the deeply isolated worlds of dementia, death, and dying.
The meaning of the pictures doesn't reside with my dad or with my mum or with the, with the people in these pictures. The meaning's constantly in flux, and so that, the audience, bring their own meanings, bring their own experience to the pictures. For me as a son, they've taught me more about the healing power of art than anything else I've ever experienced.
Watch more Nebraska Stories on our website, Facebook, and YouTube. Nebraska Stories is funded in part by the Margaret and Martha Thomas Foundation and the Bill Harris and Mary Sue Hormel Harris Fund for the presentation of cultural programming.